The moment Scott Bennett laughed at his wife in that courtroom, he believed he had already won. After 22 years of marriage, he thought he knew exactly who Jennifer Bennett was. A woman he considered ordinary. A woman he believed depended on him. A woman he was certain would leave that courthouse broken, embarrassed, and financially devastated. But what Scott didn't know was that in just a few moments, a judge would reveal a secret so shocking that his laughter would disappear forever. The same man who walked into court expecting to take everything was about to discover that the woman he had spent years looking down on was worth more money than he could even comprehend. If you've ever been underestimated, ignored, or treated as though your value depended on someone else's approval, this story will stay with you. Because what happened to Jennifer Bennett wasn't simply a divorce. It was the collapse of a carefully built illusion. For years, Scott believed he was the successful one. He believed he was the provider. He believed he was the reason their family enjoyed the life they lived. He told friends the same story. He told colleagues the same story. Eventually, he convinced himself it was true. Then came the divorce papers. Scott filed them without hesitation. He wasn't interested in counseling. He wasn't interested in repairing the marriage. In fact, according to people who knew the couple, Scott seemed unusually excited about ending it. It was almost as if he had already planned the next chapter of his life long before Jennifer knew their marriage was in trouble. He expected freedom. He expected sympathy. Most importantly, he expected money. What happened instead would become the most humiliating experience of his life. By the time this story reaches its conclusion, you'll understand how a man who thought he controlled everything lost the one thing he valued most: his sense of superiority. You'll discover why Jennifer remained silent for so many years. You'll learn how one overlooked detail changed the entire divorce case. And you'll see why the judge's words that day left an entire courtroom speechless. Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how Scott Bennett's confidence turned into disbelief, we need to go back to a time when none of this seemed possible. A time when Scott and Jennifer Bennett looked like the kind of couple everyone admired. They had been married for more than 2 decades. They owned a beautiful home. They attended family gatherings together. They smiled in photographs. To friends and neighbors, they appeared to have built a stable and successful life. But appearances can be persuasive, and sometimes the story people see is very different from the story that's actually being lived. For most of their marriage, Scott and Jennifer Bennett seemed to fit the image of a successful American couple. They met in their mid-20s, married a few years later, and built a life that many people admired from the outside. Scott was outgoing, ambitious, and confident. He had a way of making people like him almost immediately. Whether he was attending a business event or a neighborhood gathering, he often became the center of attention. Jennifer was different. She was thoughtful, reserved, and highly disciplined. She preferred listening over speaking and rarely felt the need to prove herself to anyone. In the early years of their relationship, those differences appeared to complement one another. Friends often remarked that Jennifer's calm nature balanced Scott's larger-than-life personality. For a long time, it seemed true. The first several years of marriage were not easy, but they were filled with the kind of challenges many couples face. There were mortgage payments, career decisions, family responsibilities, and unexpected setbacks. During those years, Jennifer stood firmly beside her husband. When Scott wanted to take risks in his career, she encouraged him. When projects failed, she reassured him. When opportunities appeared, she celebrated his successes as if they were her own. She believed marriage was a partnership. She believed 2 people were supposed to help each other grow. And for a while, Scott seemed to share that belief. As time passed, Scott's career began gaining momentum. Promotions arrived. His income increased. His confidence grew. At first, Jennifer was proud of him. She remembered the years when they struggled to pay bills and worried about their future. Seeing her husband achieve his goals felt like a victory for both of them. But somewhere along the way, something began to change. The confidence that once motivated Scott slowly transformed into arrogance. The appreciation he once showed Jennifer became less frequent. The respect that had defined the early years of their marriage started disappearing in small ways that were easy to overlook at first. It began with comments that sounded harmless on the surface. During dinner parties, Scott would interrupt Jennifer when she spoke. If she shared an opinion, he would dismiss it with a joke. When friends complimented her accomplishments, he would quickly redirect attention back to himself. Most people laughed because Scott delivered these remarks with a smile. Jennifer often smiled too. Yet each comment left a mark. Each joke carried a message. And over time, those messages became impossible to ignore. Friends occasionally noticed the pattern. Some wondered why Jennifer tolerated it. Others assumed they were simply witnessing the normal teasing that exists in long marriages. What nobody understood was that these moments extended far beyond public gatherings. At home, Scott increasingly treated Jennifer as though her contributions mattered less than his own. Decisions became one-sided. Conversations became lectures. Disagreements became opportunities for Scott to remind Jennifer how fortunate she supposedly was to have him. The strange part was that while Scott became more focused on status and appearances, Jennifer became more focused on building something for herself. She never announced it. She never bragged about it. She never felt the need to seek validation. Several years earlier, she had started a small consulting business from a spare room inside their home. Initially, it generated only a modest amount of income. It was the kind of side project many people start and eventually abandon. But Jennifer was persistent. She spent evenings studying market trends. She invested in her education. She developed relationships with clients. She learned from mistakes. Slowly, the business began growing. Scott barely paid attention. Whenever Jennifer attempted to discuss her work, he often seemed distracted. Sometimes he changed the subject entirely. Other times he nodded without really listening. To him, her business was little more than a hobby. He assumed it generated pocket money. He never asked detailed questions. He never requested financial reports. Most importantly, he never imagined it could become something significant. Years passed. Jennifer's client list expanded. Revenue increased. New opportunities appeared. What began as a small consulting operation evolved into something much larger. She diversified her investments. She purchased shares in growing companies. She sought professional financial advice. Every decision was carefully documented. Every investment was made legally and transparently. Yet because Jennifer rarely spoke about her success, very few people understood how much she had accomplished. Scott certainly didn't. By this point, he had become consumed by maintaining an image of success. Expensive dinners became more frequent. Luxury purchases became more common. He enjoyed being seen as the provider. He enjoyed receiving admiration from friends and colleagues. The irony was almost unbelievable. While Scott worked tirelessly to appear wealthy, Jennifer was quietly becoming wealthy. And then another change occurred. Scott began spending more time away from home. At first, the explanations sounded reasonable. Extra meetings, business trips, networking events, industry conferences. Jennifer wanted to trust her husband, so she accepted his explanations. After all, successful careers often require sacrifices. But eventually the patterns became difficult to ignore. The late nights increased. The phone calls became more secretive. Certain expenses appeared on financial statements that made little sense. Questions were met with irritation instead of answers. Jennifer's instincts told her something wasn't right. She wasn't looking for evidence when she first began noticing inconsistencies. She simply wanted honesty. Unfortunately, honesty was becoming increasingly difficult to find. One evening, while reviewing household records, she noticed several charges connected to locations Scott had never mentioned visiting. A few weeks later, another inconsistency appeared. Then another. Individually, each detail could have been explained. Together, they painted a troubling picture. For months, Jennifer said nothing. Instead, she observed. She paid attention. She listened carefully. And what she eventually discovered would force her to confront a reality she never wanted to believe. For months, Jennifer carried her suspicions quietly. She didn't confront Scott. She didn't accuse him. She didn't search for arguments or dramatic scenes. Instead, she did something that would later prove far more effective. She paid attention. Every unexplained expense, every sudden change in routine, every story that didn't quite make sense was mentally recorded. The longer she observed, the more difficult it became to ignore the pattern forming before her eyes. Scott wasn't simply becoming distant. He was living a separate life, one that seemed carefully hidden from the woman he had spent more than 2 decades married to. The confirmation came on a rainy Thursday evening. Scott had told Jennifer he would be attending an industry dinner several hours away. It wasn't unusual. He had made similar claims many times before. Jennifer expected him to return late, just as he often did. But that evening, a phone call changed everything. One of Scott's colleagues contacted the house regarding a business matter. During the conversation, the colleague casually mentioned that he was surprised Scott wasn't attending the conference scheduled for the following week. Jennifer immediately felt something was wrong. The event Scott claimed to be attending that very night wasn't happening. It was scheduled 7 days later. At first, she hoped there was an innocent explanation. A misunderstanding. A scheduling mistake. Anything that could explain the growing list of inconsistencies. Yet deep down, she already knew the truth was waiting for her. When Scott finally returned home shortly after midnight, Jennifer said nothing. She watched him walk through the front door. She listened to the explanation he volunteered before she even asked a question. She noticed details that previously might have escaped her attention. The story sounded rehearsed. Certain facts didn't match. Certain timelines made no sense. That night, Jennifer barely slept. The next morning, she began looking deeper. What she uncovered over the following weeks shattered the remaining trust she had in her marriage. There wasn't just one lie. There were dozens. There wasn't just one secret. There were many. And eventually, Jennifer discovered the one truth she had feared most. Scott was involved with another woman. The discovery itself was painful enough. But what made it even harder to accept was learning how long it had been happening. This wasn't a recent mistake. This wasn't a brief lapse in judgment. Evidence suggested the relationship had existed for a significant period of time. Vacations Jennifer never knew about. Hotel reservations connected to dates when Scott claimed to be traveling for work. Gifts purchased using accounts he assumed she never reviewed. The more Jennifer uncovered, the clearer the picture became. The man she had supported for years had been deceiving her for a very long time. Most people imagine betrayal arrives all at once. In reality, it often arrives piece by piece. One uncomfortable discovery becomes another. One explanation collapses and reveals something worse beneath it. That was exactly what Jennifer experienced. Every answer created new questions. Every question led to another painful revelation. Yet something unusual happened during this period. Rather than reacting emotionally, Jennifer became calmer. Friends later described her behavior as remarkably composed. They expected anger. They expected confrontation. They expected tears. Instead, Jennifer became focused. She continued managing her business. She continued meeting clients. She continued living her life. On the surface, very little changed. Inside, however, everything had changed. For the first time in years, Jennifer began evaluating her future without Scott in it. She reviewed her finances. She met with advisors. She organized documents. She examined investment records. She quietly prepared herself for possibilities she had never wanted to consider. The more she reviewed her financial situation, the more confidence she gained. Years of careful planning had created stability that few people knew existed. The businesses she had built were thriving. Her investment portfolio had grown substantially. Properties she purchased years earlier had appreciated significantly in value. What began as a small consulting operation had evolved into an enterprise generating income far beyond what Scott imagined. Ironically, while Scott spent years convincing himself that Jennifer depended on him, the reality was becoming the exact opposite. Then came the moment that changed everything. One evening, Scott returned home with an attitude Jennifer had never seen before. There was no guilt, no concern, no effort to hide his growing dissatisfaction with the marriage. In fact, he seemed almost eager to express it. The conversation started with minor disagreements, then criticism, then accusations. Scott complained about things that had never bothered him before. He spoke as though Jennifer was responsible for every problem in his life. The discussion continued for nearly an hour. Throughout it all, Jennifer listened quietly. Then Scott said something she would never forget. "You'd be lost without me." The words hung in the air. Perhaps Scott expected them to hurt. Perhaps he expected Jennifer to argue. Perhaps he expected her to defend herself. Instead, she simply looked at him. Because at that moment, she realized something important. Scott genuinely believed what he was saying. After all these years, he had convinced himself that he was the foundation of their entire life together. He had no idea how wrong he was. Weeks later, Jennifer would discover just how wrong. Because before she could decide what to do next, Scott made a move that surprised even her. Without warning, without discussion, without attempting to repair the marriage, Scott Bennett filed for divorce. And when Jennifer received the paperwork, she immediately understood something that Scott did not. He wasn't ending the marriage because he wanted freedom. He was ending it because he believed he was about to win. What he didn't know was that the divorce he expected to be his greatest victory was quietly becoming the biggest mistake of his life. When the divorce papers arrived, Jennifer wasn't shocked. Hurt, yes. Disappointed, certainly. But surprised? Not anymore. By that point, the marriage she thought she had built had already been dismantled piece by piece through lies, secrecy, and disrespect. The legal documents simply made official what had been happening for years. Still, there was something about seeing her marriage reduced to a stack of paperwork that felt strangely final. 22 years together. Countless memories. Shared struggles. Family celebrations. Difficult seasons. Everything condensed into signatures, dates, and legal language. Most people expected Jennifer to fight emotionally. Some expected her to beg Scott to reconsider. Others assumed she would become bitter and angry. Instead, she signed the acknowledgement of receipt, placed the papers neatly inside a folder, and continued with her day. That reaction confused Scott. He had expected drama. He had expected tears. Most of all, he had expected fear. Because in Scott's mind, Jennifer had every reason to be afraid. He genuinely believed she couldn't survive without him. The irony was that the calmer Jennifer became, the more confident Scott grew. Within weeks, he was openly discussing his future with friends and colleagues. People who knew him noticed a change in his attitude. There was a swagger to the way he carried himself. He spoke as though the divorce had already been finalized. He talked about new beginnings, new opportunities, and a future free from what he described as years of frustration. The language he used made it sound as though he had escaped some terrible burden rather than ended a 22-year marriage. Jennifer heard some of these stories through mutual friends. She rarely responded. There was no point. Scott was creating his own narrative, and nothing she said would change it. Then another detail emerged. The woman Scott had been seeing was no longer a secret. In fact, he appeared eager for people to know about her. She was younger, stylish, social, the kind of person who attracted attention wherever she went. Scott began appearing with her at restaurants, social events, and gatherings he once attended with Jennifer. Some people felt uncomfortable. Others quietly judged him. A few openly criticized his behavior. Yet Scott didn't seem concerned. If anything, he appeared proud, as though publicly replacing his wife somehow validated the choices he had made. Friends who had known the couple for years struggled to understand what had happened. The Scott they remembered had flaws, but he wasn't cruel. Somewhere along the way, success, ego, and constant praise had transformed him into someone else. Meanwhile, Jennifer focused on preparing for the legal process ahead. Unlike Scott, she understood that divorce wasn't about emotions. It was about facts, documentation, records, evidence, preparation. Every week, she met with financial advisors and legal professionals. Together, they reviewed years of business records, investment statements, contracts, tax filings, and property documents. Jennifer wanted everything organized and transparent. If questions arose, she wanted answers ready. If challenges appeared, she wanted proof available. The more her attorneys reviewed her financial situation, the more impressed they became. One attorney later described the documentation as some of the most organized financial records he had ever seen. Every investment had a paper trail. Every acquisition was documented. Every transaction was legitimate. Jennifer had spent years building her financial future with patience and discipline. And because she never felt the need to impress others, very few people understood how successful she had become. Certainly not Scott. In fact, during one meeting with his own legal team, Scott reportedly made a statement that would later haunt him. He referred to Jennifer's business ventures as small side projects. The attorneys exchanged glances. They had already begun reviewing preliminary financial disclosures. Even at that early stage, some of the numbers were attracting attention. Yet Scott dismissed every warning. When lawyers suggested they gather more information before making assumptions, Scott brushed aside their concerns. He believed he knew Jennifer. He believed he understood her finances. He believed there were no surprises waiting for him. Months passed as both sides prepared for court. During that time, something interesting began happening. The confidence Scott displayed publicly started showing cracks privately. It began during routine legal proceedings. Every time Jennifer's attorneys submitted documents, They appeared calm and prepared. Every time financial disclosures were discussed, they seemed completely comfortable. There was no panic, no urgency, no desperation. That bothered Scott more than he wanted to admit. If Jennifer was supposedly dependent on him, why wasn't she worried? If she was facing financial uncertainty, why did she appear so composed? Why did her legal team seem almost relaxed? The questions lingered in the back of his mind. Yet his ego refused to let him explore them too deeply. Instead, he convinced himself that Jennifer was simply pretending. He told himself she was hiding her fear. He told himself reality would eventually catch up with her. Unfortunately for Scott, reality was heading in a very different direction. As the court date approached, attorneys on both sides intensified their preparation. Financial experts reviewed documentation. Asset valuations were completed. Business records were analyzed. Long hours were spent examining years of financial history. And then it happened. One valuation report arrived on a lawyer's desk. The numbers were so unexpected that they were reviewed multiple times. Additional experts were consulted. Calculations were verified. Documents were cross-checked. The conclusion remained the same. Jennifer Bennett's financial position was dramatically different from what Scott believed. In fact, the gap between perception and reality was so enormous that it threatened to change the entire case. The information remained confidential for the time being. Only a small group of professionals knew the full truth. But they all shared the same reaction: shock. Because if the figures were accurate, Scott Bennett was about to walk into a courtroom carrying one of the most expensive misconceptions of his life. And the day he had been looking forward to for months was now only days away. The day he expected to celebrate. The day he expected to win. The day a single document would erase the smile from his face. The morning of the hearing arrived with an unusual sense of anticipation. For Scott Bennett, it felt like the finish line. Months of legal filings, meetings, negotiations, and preparation had led to this moment. He woke up earlier than usual, dressed carefully, and walked into the courthouse carrying the confidence of a man who believed he already knew the outcome. Friends who spoke with him in the days leading up to the hearing later recalled how optimistic he seemed. There was no sign of concern, no indication that he expected any surprises. If anything, Scott appeared relieved. He spoke about moving forward with his life. He spoke about putting the marriage behind him. He spoke as though everything had already been decided. Jennifer arrived separately. Unlike Scott, she attracted very little attention. She wasn't interested in making a statement. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She simply entered the courthouse carrying a folder containing years of documentation and took her seat beside her legal team. Observers who were present that morning would later remember one detail above all others. Jennifer looked calm. Not happy, not angry, just calm. It was the kind of calm that comes from preparation. The kind of calm that comes from knowing you have told the truth and documented every step along the way. Scott noticed it too, and for a brief moment, he found it unsettling. But only for a moment, because as proceedings began, his confidence quickly returned. The courtroom followed a familiar rhythm. Documents were reviewed. Procedural matters were addressed. Attorneys presented information. The judge listened carefully, occasionally making notes while examining various records associated with the case. For the first hour, everything seemed routine. Then the financial disclosures became the focus of discussion. That was when the atmosphere began to change. At first, the shift was subtle. A question from the judge. A request for clarification. A review of supporting documentation. Nothing dramatic. Nothing alarming. Yet several people in the room noticed that the judge was spending an unusual amount of time examining certain records connected to Jennifer's financial portfolio. The judge reviewed one document, then another, then several more. Scott remained unconcerned. He assumed the process was merely taking longer than expected. What he didn't realize was that the court was methodically working through years of financial growth he had never bothered to understand. Eventually, one of Jennifer's attorneys stood and began presenting a summary of her business interests. Scott listened casually. At first, the attorney mentioned consulting companies. Scott wasn't surprised. He already knew Jennifer owned a consulting business. What he didn't know was its current valuation. Then additional entities were mentioned: investment holdings, partnership interests, commercial assets, revenue streams, licensing agreements. The list seemed unusually long. Scott's expression changed slightly. Not fear, just confusion. He leaned forward in his chair. The attorney continued. Year after year of growth was outlined through documentation. Businesses that began as small ventures had expanded significantly. Investments purchased years earlier had appreciated dramatically. Strategic acquisitions had generated substantial returns. Every figure presented was supported by records. Every valuation had been independently verified. Every asset had been disclosed exactly as required. The room grew noticeably quieter. Scott's attorney began reviewing documents more aggressively. Pages turned faster. Notes were exchanged. Questions were whispered. For the first time all morning, uncertainty entered the equation. Then came the moment no one would forget. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at a valuation report that had been submitted into evidence. For several seconds, he said nothing. He simply reviewed the document. The silence stretched. Then he looked up. To ensure the record is clear, the judge said, I would like the total estimated valuation stated. One of Jennifer's financial experts stood. The figure that followed seemed to drain all the oxygen from the room. Scott blinked, then frowned, then looked toward his attorney. Surely there had been a mistake. A decimal point. A clerical error. A misunderstanding. The number couldn't possibly be correct. It was far larger than anything he had imagined. Far larger than anything he had ever associated with Jennifer. The financial expert calmly explained how the valuation had been calculated. Business interests, investment accounts, commercial holdings, private equity positions, appreciated assets, long-term growth. Each category was broken down carefully. Each figure was supported by evidence. The total remained unchanged. Scott's face had gone pale. For years he had spoken about Jennifer's business as though it were a hobby. For years he had dismissed her work as insignificant. For years he had assumed she earned a fraction of what he earned. Now he was sitting in a courtroom learning that the reality was entirely different. The woman he had spent years underestimating had quietly built a financial empire. And she had done it while he wasn't paying attention. The judge continued reviewing the record. But Scott barely heard the words. His mind was racing. Questions flooded his thoughts. When had this happened? How had this happened? How could he have missed something this large? The answer was painfully simple. He never looked. He never asked. He never cared enough to find out. He had been so convinced of his own importance that he failed to notice what was happening directly in front of him. As more details emerged, the situation became even worse. Many of Jennifer's most valuable assets had been structured carefully and legally over many years. Documentation showed exactly when investments were made. Records showed how businesses were developed. Ownership structures had been established properly. Everything had been handled with extraordinary attention to detail. The assumptions Scott had carried into the courtroom were collapsing one by one, and the realization was becoming impossible to ignore. The divorce he thought would elevate his lifestyle was turning into something entirely different. Because the more information the court reviewed, the clearer it became that Scott Bennett had not walked into court as the powerful spouse he imagined himself to be. He had walked into court as a man who had spent years misunderstanding the person sitting across from him. And the most devastating part of the day was still ahead, because the judge had not yet delivered his findings. And when those findings finally came, Scott would discover that learning Jennifer's true net worth was only the beginning of his nightmare. As the courtroom settled back into silence, Scott Bennett sat motionless. Only a few hours earlier, he had entered the building believing he was in control of the future. He had expected a routine conclusion. He had expected validation. Most of all, he had expected to leave with the satisfaction of knowing he had won. Now, for the first time since the proceedings began, he seemed completely unsure of what would happen next. The judge continued reviewing the documents one final time. Every page told the same story. Years of planning, years of disciplined investing, years of business growth, years of decisions that had transformed Jennifer Bennett's quiet side projects into substantial wealth. What impressed the court wasn't merely the amount of money involved. It was the consistency. The documentation was thorough. The timelines were clear. The ownership records were complete. Every major financial decision could be traced through years of supporting evidence. Nothing appeared rushed. Nothing appeared hidden. Nothing appeared questionable. Jennifer hadn't built her success overnight. She had built it patiently while living a life that attracted very little attention. The judge eventually set the final document aside and began summarizing his findings. The room listened carefully. Scott's attorney listened carefully. Jennifer listened carefully. And with each statement, the the reality of the situation became clearer. Many of the assumptions Scott had carried into the courtroom were based on information that simply wasn't true. The financial picture he believed existed was not the financial picture supported by the evidence. The woman he thought depended on him had spent years creating her own stability. The woman he thought had limited options possessed more financial independence than most people would ever achieve. The woman he thought would leave the marriage struggling had already secured a future that didn't require his support. Several of Jennifer's most valuable assets had been established, developed, and structured according to the law long before the divorce proceedings began. The records demonstrated exactly how those assets were acquired and managed. The court's role was not to reward assumptions. The court's role was to follow the facts. For Scott, those facts felt devastating. Throughout the marriage, he had measured success through appearances, expensive dinners, luxury purchases, recognition from others, the image of being important. Jennifer had measured success differently. She focused on long-term decisions, patience, discipline, consistency. While Scott worked to look successful, Jennifer had quietly become successful. The difference between those two approaches was now impossible to ignore. As the hearing neared its conclusion, observers noticed something remarkable. Jennifer never smiled. She never celebrated. She never looked toward Scott seeking satisfaction. In many ways, she appeared exactly as she had when the day began. Calm, composed, respectful. The courtroom victory everyone expected her to enjoy didn't seem to matter nearly as much as something else. Freedom. For the first time in years, she no longer had to explain herself to someone who refused to listen. She no longer had to seek approval from someone who constantly diminished her accomplishments. She no longer had to live inside a relationship where her value was measured by another person's opinion. The financial outcome was significant, but freedom was priceless. When the proceedings finally ended, people slowly began leaving the courtroom. Attorneys gathered documents. Conversations resumed. Chairs moved across the floor. The ordinary sounds of another legal proceeding coming to an end filled the room. Yet for Scott Bennett, nothing felt ordinary. The future he imagined no longer existed. The story he had told himself for years had been exposed. The confidence he carried into court had vanished. Because the most painful realization wasn't learning how much Jennifer was worth. The most painful realization was understanding how badly he had underestimated her. For years, he believed Jennifer needed him. The truth was that Jennifer had been thriving despite him, and that realization would stay with him far longer than any financial loss ever could. In the months that followed, Jennifer continued expanding her business interests. The same discipline that helped her build success carried her into the next chapter of her life. New opportunities emerged. New partnerships formed. New goals replaced old disappointments. People who knew her noticed a change. She seemed lighter, happier, more confident. Not because of the money, but because she was finally living on her own terms. Scott's journey looked very different. Friends described him as quieter, more reflective, less certain. The divorce he once viewed as a victory became a reminder of the consequences of arrogance. Some lessons arrive through failure. Others arrive through regret. For Scott, the lesson arrived inside a courtroom when a single truth shattered years of assumptions. And perhaps that's why this story resonates with so many people. Because at its heart, it isn't really about wealth. It isn't about divorce. It isn't even about revenge. It's about value. The value people place on others. The value people place on themselves. And the danger of believing you fully understand someone's worth simply because they choose not to advertise it. Jennifer Bennett never needed to prove anything. She never needed public recognition. She never needed applause. She simply kept building, kept growing, kept moving forward. And when the moment came for the truth to be revealed, she didn't have to say a word. The facts spoke for themselves. So let us know what you think. Did Scott get exactly what he deserved? Should Jennifer have revealed her success much earlier? Or was allowing the truth to emerge naturally the perfect ending to this remarkable story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful real-life stories of betrayal, resilience, unexpected twists, and life-changing moments. Because sometimes the people others overlook are the very people who end up teaching the biggest lessons of all. And sometimes the loudest laugh in the room is followed by the longest silence.